Welcome. Last time we discussed CAA reason and its first section, A, observing reason. Today we will take up B, active reason, and C, practical reason, and make our transition to C, BB, spirit. B, active reason. The actualization of rational self-consciousness through its own activity. First, a review. Consciousness, as reason, now knows that it is all reality. The unity of A, consciousness, and B, self-consciousness, meaning that the object, any object, and the self are one. The category is another name for this unity of the I and being. Reason now proceeds to actualize itself as all reality, first in the mode of theory or observing reason. It tries to find and see itself in the objects of nature and self-consciousness, in the form of laws and universals. When observing reason's efforts prove unsuccessful, it does an about-face and becomes active reason. It will now try to see itself in its object and become all reality by acting on its object, making it conform to itself. Reason does an about-face by taking its final result in physiognomy and phrenology, namely that self-consciousness, the I, is a thing, a skull, in its truth or true meaning, that of the category as the identity of independent thinghood or objectivity and self-consciousness or the I. As Hegel says, quote, self-consciousness is aware that it is in itself the objectively real world. It is no longer the immediate certainty of being all reality, but a certainty for which the immediate has the form of something cancelled. The objectivity of the immediate is self-consciousness itself, end quote. This means, 1, that reason's object, in which it expects to see itself, is now an independent self-consciousness, like itself. And 2, that since all things are now I, or self-consciousness, there are no longer any sheer things, or not I's, having being in themselves in the world. What exist are only I's, a plurality of self-consciousnesses and nothing else. Hegel next summarizes what will happen in the following dialectic, which will see immediate individual self-consciousness gradually becoming united with universality, which will result in the ethical life and substance which is spirit. Quote, to begin with, this active reason is aware of itself merely as an individual, and as such must demand and produce its reality in another. Then, however, its consciousness having raised itself into universality above Plato's divided line, it becomes universal reason and is conscious of itself as reason, as a consciousness that is already recognized in and for itself, which in its pure consciousness unites all self-consciousness, end quote. So, universal reason, the final result, is a single consciousness which unites all self-consciousness, all individual I's that comprise a nation or ethical order in which all selves recognize each other as mutually free and independent. Thus, in B, active reason, and C, practical reason, we are on the threshold of spirit. Again, in Hegel's words, quote, "Thus, as we begin the dialectic of active reason, the object to which self-consciousness is positively related is a self-consciousness. The object is in the form of thinghood, i.e., it is independent. But self-consciousness is certain that this independent object, a self-consciousness, is for it not something alien, and thus self-consciousness knows that it is in principle recognized by the object. Indeed, it is spirit, which in the duplication of its self-consciousness and in the independence of both has the certainty of its unity with itself." End quote. Hegel says this certainty, namely of reciprocal recognition, the goal of the phenomenology, must now be raised to the level of truth. What is implicit must become explicit. Before we see how this happens, here are our two questions and their brief answers. 1. Reason, or self-consciousness, will now try to find itself and its happiness in the world and in others through individual action, rather than observation and theory. Discuss why the three outlooks in B, active reason, fail. It concerns the individual versus the universal. A, pleasure and necessity. Reason first exists as an immediate, natural individual whose sole aim is sheer sexual pleasure and its own happiness. The problem is it wants to see itself as an individual in the self-consciousness confronting it. But necessity compels it to see itself as a universal instead, which results in its annihilation. It learns that universality and necessity are essential to its individuality. B, the law of the heart and the frenzy of self-conceit. The individual here now has a universal aim, seeking not just his own, but everyone's happiness. But his efforts fail because he wants everyone to accept and follow just the law of his own heart and his own social program. When the people refuse to do so, he attributes this to their being brainwashed by the media, priests and despots, and by the way of the world, the self-interest of individuals. C, virtue and the way of the world. This individual, the knight of virtue, also has a universal aim, to make everyone in society virtuous by rooting out the egos of self-seeking individuals. They should seek the universal common good, not the individual good. This too fails because the universal good cannot be realized without the actions of individuals. In fact, the universal common good and the individual good are one and the same. For to help yourself is to help others as well. 2. Here in C, practical reason, individuality as absolute reality expresses itself through action. and then uses reason to make and test laws, universals, to govern its actions and behavior. Give a brief summary and state what the result of this section is. Briefly, A, the spiritual animal kingdom. We now know that individuality fused with universality and in plural form as a group is the only and absolute reality. But for the individual to know what's inside herself, she must express herself by her actions in works. But once her work is out there, it can be judged and misinterpreted by others. So to avoid this, she pretends to be interested in what interests others, in the next big thing, the matter in hand, what really matters. But the others see through this dishonesty. The result is that everyone realizes that this desire to participate in the next big thing is universal, and that the absolute big thing is the state or nation as a whole, the ethical substance, which is the starting point of the next section, BB Spirit, the unity of all individuals in one universal substance, the kingdom of God, the Jedi Order. In brief, B, reason as lawgiver, and C, reason as testing laws, also fail, because each ethical situation is complex and unique, and because laws cannot be validated by the criterion of non-contradiction. For Hegel, the true eternal laws and customs already exist in the ethical substance or nation itself. Okay, let's see how certainty becomes truth and the implicit becomes explicit. Remember that individual self-consciousness is implicitly all reality, is the objectively real world in its entirety, that only selves or I's or individuals exist, are real, that since the object it confronts is a self-consciousness, it knows it will see itself in this object, be recognized by its object, and thus be reason as all reality, as itself and its object at once. We will look at three shapes of modern individualist self-consciousness and begin, as always, with an individual in its pure immediacy, totally bereft of universality. At the end, it will be totally united with universality, taking us into C, practical reason. Because all three individuals know they are all reality and the essence, their end and action will be to demand and produce their reality in the other before them. Reason is now sent out into the world to seek its happiness.